So, I really love beef bourguignon. It's one of my absolute favorite dishes, and I mean, why not? What's not to like? It's delicious, slow-cooked, braised beef that's super tender. It's got a delicious and rich red wine sauce, and then you've got a garnish of really delicious sautéed mushrooms and onions. But people can find beef bourguignon a little complicated, a little challenging, a little intimidating. In this video, I'm gonna go through the 3 simple steps that if you follow, you'll get a delicious, authentic French beef bourguignon in your own kitchen. Let's get started. So when I think of beef bourguignon, I'm always thinking about Julia Child's Beef Bourguignon. And that's the inspiration that we're gonna use in this recipe. You might think this starts off with the wine, and that is a crucial part of this recipe, but we're gonna come back to that in a few minutes because the first thing that we have to start off with is the meat. The first meat that we actually have to deal with is this. This is pancetta or bacon. We have to do a few special things with this before we start focusing on our beef. The rind of bacon is still on this. I'm going to blanch the rind and the bacon itself in some water. Basically what that means is I'm going to remove the rind with a really sharp knife. Then I'm gonna cut the bacon down into lardons. These are basically little strips, sort of rectangular sort of strips that look a little bit like this. And then I'm gonna put these in a simmering pot of water for about 10 minutes. This is chuck roast. So this comes from basically the shoulder of the cow. If you think about shoulders, they get used a lot. Every time the cow's walking around, the muscles are going to move. It's not like a tenderloin, which basically doesn't move at all. If you're grilling your steak, you want to go with the muscles that don't move. Tenderloins, ribeyes, strip loins, those types of things. The really tough muscles are a lot better. They're gonna break down, they're gonna get really tender, and they're gonna be really delicious. So I need to cut this huge piece of meat down into pretty large pieces because they're gonna shrink a bit when we cook them, but also I think it's a nicer way to serve the final product. Once that's done, I'm gonna set my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. There is a super important trick that completely changed the way I make beef stews. But before we do that, we need to get our bacon set up. I'm gonna saute these in a little bit of oil over moderate heat for about 2 to 3 minutes. We want a light browning on these, nothing too crazy. Now we have to deal with the most important meat of this recipe, the beef. You want this really hot. I'm only gonna add a few pieces at a time because if you add too much all at once, the temperature in the pan drops too much, and instead of searing it, you end up basically boiling the meat, and you're not gonna get the really delicious crust that we want on the outside of this meat. So all the pieces of meat have been browned. It's gonna take a few minutes. You'll be rewarded at the end because we are really starting to build a lot of flavor. But it's called beef bourguignon for a reason. We've got the beef part. It would be nothing without the bourguignon part, which is the sauce. And the key with any, I guess, French sauce, or really any sauce in general, is that we are going to start building layers and layers of flavor. And we're gonna talk about the wine. I promised we were gonna talk about the wine. We'll be there in just a second, but before we do that, we need to use some aromatic root vegetables. And Julia Child suggests using carrots and onions. And I have to say, what she does with these is absolutely brilliant. First thing that we need to do is peel them and then cut them down into really large pieces. We're gonna go back to the exact same pot that we sauteed the bacon and the beef in, and now saute our vegetables. We're gonna do this until they're brown. It should only really take a couple of minutes. And then once it's done, we can pour out that sauteing fat. It's done its job. It's helped us brown everything out. We don't want to leave it in because there's basically too much in there. It'll make our sauce really greasy. So make sure you remember how big we've left these vegetables. It's going to be really important when we get to the final step of the beef bourguignon process. But now let's get back to the beef. And there's one little step in here that Julia does in her recipe that I think takes this to the absolute next level. I'm going to season this with just a little bit of salt and pepper. We don't want to go too heavy on the salt and pepper because we can add some of this later. And we're going to toss this with a little bit of flour. Now the flour is gonna do 2 things. One, it's gonna help thicken up the sauce at the end, and it's also gonna help sort of crust this meat. So once the flour is added, stir it lightly, and then we're gonna throw it in the oven for 4 minutes. Now after 4 minutes, I'm gonna give everything a toss just so that the other side can get browned as well. Then we can take the pot out of the oven. I'm gonna turn my oven down to 325 Fahrenheit, and now we can continue making our sauce and talk about the wine. There are a lot of different choices when it comes to wine. What I'm gonna use is Tempranillo. It's relatively cheap where I live, and it has a lot of the characteristics that you would find in a Pinot Noir or in a Burgundy style wine. This is a list of other wines that you might consider using in the beef bourguignon. As long as you would drink it, it's gonna be perfectly fine. Don't go with the crazy expensive wines. I like to veer a little bit on the cheaper side on this, but don't go too cheap. This Tempranillo is good for me. This recipe uses a whole bottle of red wine, 750 milliliters, and then I'm gonna add a little bit of beef stock. You just wanna make sure everything's covered. Then we're gonna continue to amp up the flavor by adding a little bit of tomato paste, a few lightly crushed cloves of garlic, a large sprig of thyme, a bay leaf, and that blanched bacon rind from earlier. Stir everything together and bring it to a gentle simmer, and then cover it, and then we're going into the oven for a few hours. So I managed to spill red wine all over myself in the last step, so I've had to change sweaters. Occupational hazard, I guess. Anyway, the beef is in the oven getting all tender and delicious, which is gonna give us enough time to do the third and final step of how to make a beef bourguignon, and that's the garnish. So a lot of beef stews and even other beef bourguignon recipes will just throw all the vegetables in at the beginning and braise everything all together, but not in Julia Child's recipe. The vegetables that we added earlier are there to flavor the sauce. For the garnish, we're gonna make everything separately. I've got mushrooms here. We're gonna deal with these a little bit later because this happens really, really quickly. The thing that I'm gonna start off with is a pearl onion. Now these little guys are really, they're really small and they go everywhere. They can be a little irritating to make, but if we use a few little tips and tricks, a few little hacks, we can turn these into an incredible garnish for our beef bourguignon. The absolute easiest way to peel one of these guys is to just put them in a bit of boiling water. If you leave them in here for a couple of minutes, the onion itself isn't gonna cook, but if we leave them in there, the skins loosen up. So I'm gonna boil them for just a couple of minutes and then dunk them in an ice bath to stop the cooking. Then I can just really easily pull the skin off like this, and we've got a whole bunch of pearl onions done relatively easily. Then once that's done, I can braise these. I'm just gonna add a bit of butter and oil into a frying pan, and then as soon as it's bubbling, I'm gonna add all of my peeled pearl onions in and saute them over medium-ish heat for about 7 to 10 minutes, or until they look a little like this. After that's done, I'm gonna add a little bit more of that beef stock I used earlier and season it with some salt and a bit of pepper, a small bay leaf, maybe some thyme, and I've got a little bit of parsley. Cover it and then slowly simmer these for about 40 or 50 minutes. After that, you're gonna have these really syrupy, really delicious onions that are the perfect garnish for the beef bourguignon. And then the last thing is my sauteed mushrooms. This really only takes about 5 or 10 minutes. And first thing is I'm gonna clean up these mushrooms because they're pretty dirty. I'm gonna rinse them in a bit of water and then use a bit of paper towel and then cut them down into quarters. And then add some butter and oil into a skillet over medium-high heat. Once it's foaming, I'm gonna add my mushrooms into the pan, toss them and shake them for about 4 to 5 minutes. What's gonna happen is first, the mushrooms are gonna absorb that fat, the butter, and the oil, and then they'll start to brown. That's as easy as the sauteed mushrooms are. I'm gonna set those aside, and we've got the two components of our garnish. Our beef's been going now for just over 3 hours at this point. We can pull it out, and let's see how we did. This carrot basically has no flavor left in it. All of the flavor from this has gone into the sauce and into the beef bourguignon. The onions and the carrots that we put in here should be thrown out at this point. This might sound crazy to you, but it's what takes this stew from being just okay to being a whole next level. If you like carrots in your beef bourguignon, feel free to add some, but do what we did with the garnish step of this recipe where we basically created them separate. So now what we need to do is throw out the carrots, the onions, basically everything except the beef and the bacon. Add that into the original pot along with our mushrooms and our onions. And then in a separate pot, we're gonna reduce the braising liquid until it lightly coats the back of a spoon. Once it does, we can add it back to the pot, cover this, and we're gonna heat it for about 3 minutes. And we're basically done at this point. Let's see how we did. So this is outrageously good. The beef is so tender, like look at it just falling apart here. The sauce is really, really rich. Everything is fantastic. This is just an outstanding dish. So that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time. Oh yeah.